wine ties together art and geography and science and commerce and history, even religion. And then we get the five senses, the taste, smell, and so on. So it's a full sensory experience layered on top of that. And I think what makes wine different from food, and this gets short shrift, is that it's a drug. Now, I know in excess, it's dangerous, but I think there's a power in the fact that there is a buzz and you can get these mind-altering states. Michael Pollan has just started writing about that. Omnivore's Dilemma, How to Change Your Mind.
For ayahuasca.
There you go. Exactly. And I think we overlook that with wine often. Anyway, wine brought it all together for me. It was a full-bodied experience from, mind to heart to full body.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 172. What does it mean to be a supertaster? How did wine consumption habits change during the pandemic? Do Canadians have different wine preferences compared to drinkers in other regions? And why is food and wine pairing such a great way to get into the world of wine? You'll hear those stories and more during my chat with Robert Vernick and Peter Yeung, co-hosts of the terrific XChateau podcast. They're interviewing me this time. Now, on a personal note, before we dive into the show with the continuing story of publishing my new wine memoir, your memoir isn't literary, the editor said. What? I asked. I felt dumb. I'd always been with the smart kids in high school, graduated with honors from the MBA program at Western, won literary writing awards. What the F happened since then? Your memoir is commercial, she said. Now I felt cheap and salesy, like a word hustler. What's the difference? I asked. Well, there's some crossover between the categories, but literary books focus on the internal lives of characters, beautifully crafted sentences, and echoes of previous literary works, however obscure, she explained. Commercial books are plot-driven, entertaining, and fast-paced. You read them for a gripping story, like mysteries and thrillers, not for the artistry of the writing. This made me feel even worse. Even though my memoir is plot-driven, what happens during one hellish roller coaster of a year, can't my sentences be pretty too? I bleated. She smiled. Sure, Natalie, they're not mutually exclusive. And here's the upside. Commercial books are often available at all the major bookstores, plus other stores like Walmart, Costco, Target, maybe even Pottery Barn. Literary books often don't get as widespread distribution. Well, that still wasn't exactly comforting. But then I thought about my mission for this memoir, to get its message out to as many people who need or want to hear it. Wider distribution is surely going to help with that. So I'm going to swallow my pride and prejudice for the greater good that I believe that this memoir can do. But I'm not giving up on pretty sentences. I've posted a link to the blog post called Diary of a Book Launch in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/172. This is where I share more behind-the-scenes stories about the journey of taking this memoir from idea to publication. If you want a more intimate insider seat beside me on this journey, please let me know that you'd like to become a beta reader and get a sneak peek at the manuscript. Email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. In the show notes, you'll also find my email contact, the full transcript of my conversation with Peter and Robert, links to their website and podcast, how you can join me in a free online wine and food pairing class, and where you can find the live stream video version of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live every Wednesday at 7 p.m. That's all in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/172. Okay, on with the show.
Welcome to this episode of XChateau. Today, our guest is Natalie McLean, wine podcaster and writer. Welcome to the show, Natalie.
Hey, Robert, Peter, it's good to be here with you.
I was hoping you could give our listeners a background about your experience in wine and what do you write about, what is your podcast about, and what is your kind of overall platform?
Sure. Well, I didn't start off in this industry as a lot of people don't. I kind of stumbled into it. I did an MBA, and then afterwards I went into consumer packaged good marketing at P&G and then high tech. And then I thought, well, I'll take a sommelier course for fun at night because golf and Spanish just did not stick. And once I got into this course, it ended up being a diploma program. I thought, this is perfect for someone who's just a little more than slightly obsessive compulsive. This satisfies everything. So, as you know, wine ties together art and geography and science and commerce and history, even religion. And then we get the five senses, the taste, smell, and so on. So it's a full sensory experience layered on top of that. And I think what makes wine different from food, and this gets short shrift, I think, is that it's a drug. Now, I know in excess, it's dangerous, but I think there's a power in the fact that there is a buzz and you can get these mind-altering states. Michael Pollan has just started writing about that. Omnivore's Dilemma, How to Change Your Mind.
For ayahuasca. He's a big ayahuasca proponent.
There you go. Exactly. And I think we overlook that with wine often. Anyway, so long-winded answer to say, wine brought it all together for me. It was a full-bodied experience from, mind to heart to full body. Yeah, that's how I got started in it. That really turned me on to wine. And then it started with just cold calling editors, getting published in magazines and newsletters or newspapers. Eventually writing a couple of books that led to the courses and the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. And here we are.
So what made you jump from, I like this product, I find it intriguing mentally and super engaging, to I want to write about that? And I want to make content about that, because that's a different level of commitment.
It is.
Peter and I well know. So.
Exactly. And I didn't even drink alcohol until my late 20s. Like after I graduated from the MBA, I wasn't even into beer, whiskey, spirits, anything. Came from a Nova Scotia family, and that was just too bitter. It turns out I'm a supertaster, so that's probably why, but whatever. But wine had it. Well, actually, it was wine in a restaurant that really turned me on. It was a Brunello out in a restaurant. And I just thought, oh my gosh, this is unlike anything I've ever tried. And it was the search for words to capture the experience. Words failed me. I didn't know how to describe it, but I knew I wanted more of it and I wanted to understand it more. Because again, that wasn't my world, not even booze. But I thought, I need this in my life and I need to know how to talk about it.
So supertaster meaning you have a lot of taste buds, a higher concentration of taste buds?
Yes. So Tim Haney did that test where they dye your tongue blue and then they get in with all kinds of contraptions and look at that. But it's a sensitivity to bitterness, which probably explains why I didn't get into beer and whiskey. I just found them too bitter.
That's why I was going to be surprised that Brunello would be the wine that got you into wine, given it's highly tannic, therefore highly bitter. Because normally people who have a high concentration of taste buds will prefer sweet. And so sweeter wines and less bitter things.
That's true. It was an Italian restaurant, so they didn't have anything sweet. But the Brunello had that fruit component that softened bitterness. And so I think the bitterness would have hit me at the back. But I remember the first taste and going, this is delicious. And it smells good too. So what's going on here?
So you're truly a multi-channel, multimedia wine person in Canada with books, a subscription website, a newsletter, wine courses, videos, TV appearances, podcasts. I'm going to run out of words, I think. A mobile app. How do you split your time between all those different things?
Well, it helps that I'm an insomniac to begin with. So really, the majority of my time these days goes toward the online food and wine pairing courses. I love it. My mother was a teacher. My grandmother was a teacher. I feel like I'm coming full circle to what I love to do, which is the writing and the teaching. And so with the online courses, students come to me from around the world. I am based in Canada, but my audience is global. I mean, I would say the concentration is in the US and Canada, but then I get students from Europe and the UK and Australia and so on. But what happens is that even after they finish the course, they get lifetime access to all the materials. And I do biweekly tastings with them. So they get lifetime access to me as long as I'm still kicking. And it becomes kind of a tasting group for them. And they connect with other wine lovers. And it's a way to continually improve their skills. So I find it appeals both to the beginners who come along the journey and learn about wine, but it also appeals to a lot of hospitality and trade staff because they're looking for those tasting groups, especially during the pandemic. It's just convenient, right? You can do it from home. I mean, we all know Zoom and everything else, but I think there's still that connection that can happen and that regularity of meeting with the same people who share your passion.
Mm. So, what do you consider yourself then, a wine educator? Or I know you review wine. So, is it a wine critic or a journalist and influencer? Some of these words are probably outdated these days, but
I think wine storyteller is the common thread through everything. So, in my books, the first one was Red, White, and Drunk All Over. So, you can imagine how seriously I take my topic and myself. But I love day in the life approach, sort of the new journalism school, Truman Capote, Joan Didion, and so on. They did what they wrote about so that they could get deeper insights into their topics rather than just sort of only interviewing someone or watching from the sidelines. So I became a sommelier for a night in a 5-diamond restaurant. I worked the harvest with Randall Graham at Bonnie Doon in California. I worked in a New York liquor store and a San Francisco store to see about buying wine. So each of those experiences, I extracted stories, and then wrapped up in these stories were ways to, or tips on how to buy, pair, and taste wine like a pro. But it's kind of, I harken back to my mom who always hid my peas in the mashed potatoes. So the education is snuck in there because, as you know, we're wired for stories. We love stories. And it's the stories that are the hook to hang the learning on. Like, I think you really need to remember, we best remember things through stories. Like, I went shark diving, and then, of course, we retire from shark diving off the coast of South Africa in my second book, Unquenchable, and of course, talk about seafood and wine pairings. No sharks were harmed, but I'll milk a goat, and then we're talking about cheese and wine or whatever. But it's the story wrapped around the learning that is my focus.
Cheese terroir.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. So, say you're going to write an article for someone or do something for a brand. How would you describe your core audience to a consumer or to a brand if they were going to work with you or a publisher?
I think because of the focus on storytelling and on the practical side, the food and wine pairing, it is pretty broad because I find, even as I say, hospitality and trade will come take my courses because of the focus on food and wine pairing, which often gets overlooked or just, it's not a heavy focus in some of the more formalized courses. But that approach appeals also and is less intimidating to those who are just beginning their journey. Everyone loves stories. Everyone loves food and wine pairing. But if I'm talking about it from, say, an advertising perspective or someone who wants to work with our community, we have 300,000 subscribers to the newsletter. So we can geo-target or target pockets of who's buying what and all that sort of thing. So it becomes very much segmentation after that. But I'd say our population or our community sort of falls out along the general population, with high-end, your collectors or whatever being very small percentage, and then a broader swath of everyday wine drinkers.
So, trader mainly coming to you for the focus on food and wine pairings. Consumers are coming for the somewhat less like rigid tasting structure. Okay, so that's interesting. And then I noticed that on your website, you also have like the prices of wines, but you're based in Ottawa. Like, how does that work if you have a large audience in the US as well? Are you using like LCBO pricing, using like wine searcher pricing? How are you translating that cross-border thing? Because the pricings can be quite different between certain parts of the US and Canada.
So it's usually a pleasant surprise for my US subscribers because it's like deduct 30% and you're good to go. But I do use LCBO pricing. My mobile apps, they scan the barcode and the front label. So I don't know of any other apps that do both. There's a lot of front label scanners and there's a few back barcode, but we do both. It's integrated.
we don't have barcodes on a lot of
Right.
wine
Okay,
here,
there you
so.
go. So what we've integrated is liquor stores across the country, their pricing, but also real-time geo inventory. So, I can tell if you let me through the app where you are, the closest liquor store to you that has the wine, how many bottles are in stock, and the price at that liquor store.
Wow.
I mean, it goes back to my high-tech geekiness. One of the first things I did when I transitioned from high-tech into wine.
That's just an API into like the LCBO's inventory. I guess that's easier to do when you have monopoly markets. If you were in California or New York and there's like tons of retailers around, that'd be really tough to do. Or even Alberta.
Exactly, where it's privatized. But a lot of the other provinces are still sort of pre-prohibition. So one of the few advantages. But yeah, so when it comes to people who live outside of Canada, they still find the information helpful in that it's clean data. I mean, the vintage is correct, the blends are correct. I mean, there's 90 other pieces of information about each wine. So the price will be different and you'll need to find it locally, but they still find the virtual seller in the app and all kinds of things, buy list, wish list, buy again, all that kind of thing. Those functionalities are still useful.
So I'm curious, being American and you're in Canada, what's the reception or how are American wines perceived in Canada in general? Do you feel like comfortable enough to speak about that?
Oh, sure. I know that the 4 big regions are well represented here. So California, Washington, Oregon, and New York State. And they all have pretty good marketing campaigns. So they care about this market. I think we're your number one export market, I believe. I could be wrong on that. But yeah, what happened during the pandemic was interesting. All wine consumption rose. Certainly the bottom end rose, but premium wines also rose. I don't know if this happened in the States. So those who were staying home with disposable income, and particularly those who had, I think they say $60,000 and up, those were the people who could stay at home, stay employed. They couldn't spend their money as much on restaurants, travel, et cetera. So they ratcheted up on premium wines. And for us, that's often those from the US, not just because of the exchange rate, but because that's kind of the tier that they're in for the most part. So they've done really well, US wines across the board. And I think that's going to stick because people have had a taste of better wines as they jumped, not the whole gain, but I think there'll be a permanent effect on US wine purchase here.
Just for definition purposes, when you say premium wine, is that $20 and above, or what's the definition?
Yeah, I know that there's some really seemingly low definitions of premium wine. Like in the industry, it's sometimes, I don't know, like $10 to $15 or whatever.
Right.
But yeah, I think of it as over $20.
Okay.
For sure. Canadian dollars.
Would you say that there's a Canadian palate? Like, would you say, based on your experience in tasting with students from different parts of Canada, that they have a slightly different palate than the US? And if so, how?
Our wines, which are pretty awesome, are all made in a cool climate. We really don't have any warm climates here. Even BC, which is the end of the Sonoran Desert, is still considered a cool climate. So, as you know, what that means is that they're edgy and nervy in terms of their acidity. They don't tend to be fruit bombs. But at the same time, we don't have that long culture of wine drinking that a lot of European countries have had. So I think if we put that all together, if there is such a thing as a Canadian palate, it's probably more toward those cool climate wines. There's a lot of experimentation, but we grew up with beer and whiskey. We're a northern clime kind of region. That's our heritage. We make beer, we make whiskey, but not wine until recently, the last 25 years.
And how is ice wine then considered in Canada? It's a home product. Is it something Canadians actually enjoy more frequently, or like the rest of the world, sweet wines are kind of out of favor and it's a specialty item?
Well, ice wine, as you know, put us on the map globally, winning the first major awards in international competitions. So ice wine is good for us as a flagship, but it's a double-edged sword. It can also be just like kind of stereotyping, like maple syrup, Mounties, moose, beaver tails. So I think it's great that it led the way and it was a premium product. But now I think the challenge is broadening that perception of Canadian wine because we make spectacular, Pinot Noir, Riesling, Chardonnay, sparkling wine, Gamay, Cab Franc. Those wines don't have the same distribution as ice wine. But that's what's here and what's exciting for
It's also
people
a
to
lot higher
discover.
volume production than ice wine as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's been maybe 15 years since I've had many still Canadian wines. So you mentioned you have a passion for the food and wine pairing and that element. Is that your core content, or how else would you describe your core content, given that you do a lot of wine reviews and other wine education, etc.?
Sure. I think food and wine pairing is my core focus in terms of content on the site. It's part of the books, but I haven't written wine and food pairing books. They're more like adventure stories or however you want to characterize them. But food and wine pairing is definitely what I do because I have a lot of tools on the site that do matching. I have recipes that are all paired with wines. The mobile apps will pair the wines as well and the articles. And I just think that, food is such an easy way to come into the wine category, but it's also a fascinating way to grow your knowledge as you become more expert. You look at a roast chicken, we're not checking its vintage chart. It's not overwhelming. It's not like you're standing in the supermarket looking at rows and rows of different types of roast chicken from different regions and sub-appellations. I mean, it's really easy. We're not intimidated by roast chicken. So if we start with the food and then pair it with the wine as a way to understand more about the wine, I think that's a lot more accessible without dumbing it down. Because, of course, then you can get into sauces and preparations and different wines that might work and all the rest of it. But I think it's a great jumping off point.
And you mentioned Tim Hanai earlier and his work. Do you leverage a lot of his research in your practice, using acid and salt and other things to adjust the food to pair with the wine? And I think his motto is drink the wines you like, right? And
Yeah,
eat the
pair the wine
food
to
you
the
like.
diner, not the dinner. Yeah, I love his philosophy. I really enjoyed meeting him. He changed the way I thought about food and wine, that often you can calibrate. Like, as he said, if you've got this steak and you somehow ended up with maybe a white wine or whatever that's not the classic match, put some salt on your steak and see how it transforms the wine, and the pairing just might work for you. But I do love his pair the wine to the diner, not the dinner. I think that's fabulous. It tells us all just to relax. If the pairing doesn't work, have a bun in between, not to get too uptight. But yeah, I think with Tim, it was almost spooky when he did my assessment, because he not only told me I was a super taster, he said, "I'll bet you cut the tags out of clothing." And I said, "How did you know that?" But it's all about being highly sensitive to a lot of things. So I think his way of looking at things, looking at wine as an integrated part of how you perceive the world, is really amazing.
So which of the content, whether it's the food and wine, which you said you have classes and stuff about, or the reviews, which of that content tends to drive people to like sign up for a class or pay for a newsletter or something?
Well, I kind of think of it like Jeff Bezos in one of his books. He has the communication flywheel, right? So you can come in different ways, whether it's the mobile apps, the books, the newsletter, and so on. I think at first it was the books because they did very well. And Amazon actually named them both best books of the year. So that means they were pumping it up on their algorithm.
Cool.
Yeah, it was cool. It really helped sales. Well, especially Unquenchable, the second book, was mentioning my website more because this is back in 2011. Red, White, and Drunk All Over was 2006, kind of the Paleolithic era of the of the internet, feeling very old. So it brought people into my world through the books. And as you know, books are such a deep connection. You've written one, Peter. I'm not sure if you've written one yet, Robert.
Not
or
yet.
Plan to. Okay. All right. There's always time, of course. But, they take that deep dive with you and they stay with you. It's kind of like podcasting, too. I find the two very similar. We know that podcast listeners stay with you. Like studies show that people will listen to a 30, 60-minute podcast 80 to 100% of the way through. Whereas Facebook video, they're gone average in like 30 seconds or 2 minutes, even if they were intentionally there. There's a different kind of attention and engagement with both books and with podcasts. And so to answer your question, I think at first it was the books, but they've been a while. I still get royalty checks though. So they do last, Peter. I know you were wondering.
Good. Except mine are too small. Too niche market.
These days it's all about the, long tail, right? So people will find you and your book on luxury wine marketing. I can't wait to talk to you about that on the podcast, and Robert, to you as well, about the work you've done. but they will stay with you. And I think now the transition, though, has been to the podcast in terms of listeners until I publish book 3.
So I am curious in terms of the synergy between those things, because I definitely agree with you that podcasts have this, whether it's from the advertising front or just from the storytelling front, you hearing there's so much fidelity in the human voice that hearing that, especially when you're not looking at something, in some ways makes it like resonate better. And I could see where I like to talk. I'm not the best writer, hence I haven't written a book. Then there's all these other things in terms of social media that is much more ephemeral content where it's kind of like in the moment. It needs a hook in the first couple seconds and go from there. But it's hard to be good at all of those areas. And then you also mentioned your mobile app, and it's hard to get people to download an app these days. It's not like it was 10 years ago where there weren't that many selections in terms of things. There's so many apps on all these stores. So I'm curious on like, how do you play in so many spaces at once? I do social media, we do the podcast. I already find that daunting, let alone all the other things that you're doing.
Well, I don't know. I have a short attention span, but I've been at this for a long time. It's been 20 years since I started writing about wine. So you build up over time and you bring people into your world over time. I mean, 300,000 subscribers is not last year. It's 20-year journey. Over time, you also narrow down what it is you love most and what do you focus on. So the mobile apps, I haven't made a lot of updates to them in the last 2 years. They automatically feed in my new wine reviews, but that's not me adding them manually. So those kind of run on their own. They're not taking up a lot of time. With the podcast, I'll repurpose it on Facebook Live. So I'm trying to, recycle where I can, because you want to go to consumers or listeners or readers where they're at. So, there's a certain audience who listens to the podcast, but there's others who are on social media, but I'm cross-purposing the content a lot as well. So that helps. But again, I'm really jazzed about the podcast right now and the potential of podcasting. I'm so glad you guys are in this space as well, because Robert, you talk about the fidelity of the human voice, and it's almost better if there's no visuals. I totally agree. It's like you're millimeters from somebody's brain. It's very intimate. It's almost like it sparks off the theater of the mind. And there's nothing like it. You co-create that experience, your listener and you, through your voice. It's very, very powerful. So I think you guys should double down, and the podcast is the way to go. Podcasts and books.
It's while they're stuck in their car or on a train. So we're just like subliminally programming them.
Exactly. And yet you take a journey. So over time, they feel they know you, like you're friends. And I love that. Like I love that connection, the deeper connection that I just can't seem to find on social media.
Well, and the other thing is like we've dabbled a little bit in advertising for the podcast, and the fact that Peter and I talk about something and we try to make it so it's personal. Like we're trying to make it so it's not just someone else pre-recorded thing into our podcast, because we think that wouldn't be authentic to our voice. So I'm curious for you, like in terms of revenue drivers for your business, and I'm curious on how it's changed over time. Like obviously you have the book royalties, you have the apps and the subscription for your newsletter, but then you have the podcast. Like where is the main revenue coming for you now, from which channel? And have you seen that change over time?
Sure. It would be the courses. And that has changed because it's just in the last 5 years that I've been offering food and wine pairing courses. So I didn't have that at the beginning. At the very start, it was magazine and newspaper articles, but that's kind of dried up. Oh my goodness. It's so tough. I don't know how anybody makes a full-time living.
I heard Forbes pays $50 an article.
Oh yeah. Like what's that going to get you?
You write a lot of articles.
Exactly. And newspapers are even worse. I mean, it's just the rates. But as you know, the columns have just dried up completely as well. I only have one magazine article right now, and it doesn't even keep me in California Cabernet. So, but I still do it. But so the majority of income would be the online courses, and then followed by the wine reviews subscriptions. I do have advertising that would probably come in at number 3. And then the books have trailed off because it's been so many years, but I am writing another one, so I have hope.
And so for the courses, is your goal to add on more courses that they can, over time to build up like a library of different things? Like I think of like the Wine Scholar Guild as kind of like started with French Wine Scholar and then, essentially expanded over time.
Exactly. My approach will be 2 courses only, ever. Because I don't know if it's Procter & Gamble that taught me to double down on a unique selling proposition and stop trying to be everything to everybody. But my course right now is the Get Wine Smart course or the Wine Smart course, a full-bodied framework to pair, buy, and taste wine like a pro. That is the course I offer right now, and it's very much focused on food and wine pairing. I've done a second course, a beta on wine and cheese pairing that's just that topic, and that's huge.
Oh.
And I'm going to launch that sometime when I have the time. It went very well in beta, and I'm going to launch it as a full-fledged course with Evergreen or lifetime access. But that's it. I just want to perfect those courses. I want to keep adding to them. I want to find better ways to market them. I don't want to, shiny new syndrome. What is it? Shiny new thing syndrome. I don't want to chase after a bunch of different courses because I can't do that. I can't be all things to all people. I want to do what I do better, deeper. That will be my strategy. Two only, that's it.
And I am curious if, obviously you do wine reviews, and I noticed that you do have a score, but you're also telling these stories about these wines. And have you thought over time to sort of go away from scoring and just put your opinion out there in words in the story and give the background and walk away from it? Because it seems like the number and the story are sometimes maybe at odds with each other.
Yeah, they are. I mean, how can you trap a subjective experience in a score? And we all know it's one moment in time, one person's perception. How useful is that? The first 3 years that I wrote about wine, I did not score wines. I thought that's just silly. Like it's like scoring, I don't know, flowers or something. But over time, people would email me a lot and say, I want to score. They were the people who didn't want to spend as much time thinking about wine as I did. It was shorthand, right, for quality. And they do the QPR, the quality price ratio. Quality, the measure is the score, price, and they try to optimize, even though that can get you into drinking maybe a Beaujolais when you prefer a robust Cabernet. But, what are you going to do? So I do score wines. I probably will never walk away from that. I'm comfortable doing it now, but it's also service to my readers. They want them. So my passion will always be in writing, but the service component is in the scores. And it's just, I was a total score snob at the beginning because I thought, it's like the difference between recipes in the food world and those moving food memoirs. I want to be where the real action is, the long form narrative. That is where the writers are. Recipes, wine reviews, house fires. But I had to get over myself. I'm still doing that and realize, hey, these reviews or the scores themselves, people want them. So just do it.
And you've had a lot of success with your newsletter, over 300,000 subscribers over your 20-year history. What's the key value proposition of subscribing to the newsletter?
Sure. So the newsletter itself is free. What you pay for on my site is access to the wine reviews. So the actual scores and tasting notes that I give each wine. The mobile apps are free. So you'll get all the information on the wine. You just won't get my score and tasting note until you pay up $3 a month. So the value of the newsletter is that's where all the pairing tips are. So we go into much more depth in the course, but the newsletter has quick tips like, would you normally put butter or lemon on this food? If it's butter, go with maybe an oak Chardonnay. If it's lemon, go with a zesty, acidic, or racy Riesling or Sauvignon Blanc. Tips like that, quick tips that help them find better wines, deepen their pleasure. That's what they're paying. And I do a lot of videos. So again, I'll repurpose my television videos in the newsletter, but those are all quick tips. And that's what people want from that.
And do you have a sense of how you acquired all these subscribers? Like what were the big marketing channels or reasons, ways of which you built eventually to 300,000?
Sure. So being one of the early adopters, coming from high tech and having a website back in, as I say, the Paleolithic era of, it was 2000 that I started the website. And I started emailing friends and family at that time. It wasn't even a newsletter, it was just an email to everybody. So that evolved. So time has been on my side, but also the 2 books that really exploded it for me because not only did the books themselves reach a wider audience, because I was fortunate enough to work with Random House for both of those books, but also the book tours. I mean, it opened up my eyes to television stations. It's how I got on TV the first time. They'd interview me about the book and they'd say, do you want to come back and talk about, I don't know, wines for turkey dinner? And sure. So that opened up all that media that I never knew existed and gave me those contacts. That was the early boost. But now, as I say, it's the podcast, and it helps that I've been fortunate enough to be recommended by the New York Times for the podcast and other lists. But those are the people, those podcast people, whether you're on lists or not, they tell other people, you really want to learn about wine? Go listen to this. And then they stay with you. They're very loyal.
And then they subscribe to the newsletter.
Yes, that's the grand plan. That's the big master scheme. It's like, okay, now take my course.
Yeah.
Is there a really high overlap between people who've taken your course and people who are in your newsletter? Is it like that Venn diagram is like squarely in the subscribers of your newsletter?
The biggest overlap is between the podcast and the courses.
Oh, really?
They're
Okay.
big commitment. And then the books, but that's petering off because, the last one was 2011.
I really dislike that terminology.
Oh, sorry. Oh, that's personal, isn't it? I'm sorry.
I'm going to be saying that all the time now.
You can
well,
edit
now
that
I have
out.
to teach my daughter Piper that she shouldn't like the term pipe down.
So cute, Piper. That's great. No, but yeah. So anyway,
so the podcast and the courses have the strongest overlap. Interesting.
Yes.
Okay. So
yes, commitment.
And you find that the podcast is usually the first one, and then they move. And it's hard because you don't get that much information from podcasts, right? In terms of the data, the analytics. So, but you're assuming that people go from the podcast over into the course.
Yes. I mean, whenever anybody registers for the website or the podcast, I'll ask them, do you want the newsletter? But because I always follow up after someone signs up for my course, I always ask, how did you hear about the course? And it's usually the podcast. And so I realize that they're the best customers I have. They're not the most, as with everything, but they're the people who will pay because they've gotten to know me. Like, I know myself, I didn't take my first online course about how to create online courses, kind of meta, until I listened to the podcast of a woman who taught online courses, how to create them. I listened to all 156 episodes. I just binged. And then I felt I knew her. I could trust her. She knew what she was talking about. But it was only after listening to all of them that I finally signed up for her course.
Interesting. So, and in terms of other media driving towards it, in terms of social media, I'm curious on what are you doing, either YouTube or Facebook or Instagram, TikTok, even to drive people to there? And have you seen the same kind of similar growth just at an earlier stage than the podcast, or how has that worked out for you?
Yeah, the social media will tend to get people either over to the newsletter or requesting my free wine and food pairing guide, which your listeners can get too. So they'll tend to be low commitment and not paying. They'll come in through those channels, but then they're in your circle of communication and you hope to grow with them in trust in other ways. So yeah, with social media, you kind of have to be there, especially if you want to publish another book. They're always going to look at your platform, though nothing beats email. Like it seems so retro, nothing beats email. Mm-hmm. It's that direct, you own it. It's not rented land like social media is. But you kind of still have to be on all the places. So I am, but I get help with that from an assistant. And so she will flag anything that needs a personal response from me, but she's posting the content, whether it's repurposed from TV or somewhere else to keep the channels alive.
So I'm assuming that in your podcast, kind of like teasing out like, hey, and by the way, you can like mentioning it at least once an episode about your courses, and that's going to help that conversion. That's a correct assumption, right?
What I tease is that they can take a free class with me at nataliemclean.com/class. So that's a webinar. All right. It's going to give you food and wine pairing tips, half a dozen of them. So deliver value first. And then the bottom part of it, or the last part of it, is talking about my course, my online course for which you would have to pay. So I'm always driving people to something free, whether it's the pairing guide that they like, or the free pairing class online, because you got to warm them up, I think. There's just some people who will stumble on my website, look at the course section, and just buy it from that. But they probably know me in some other way first.
Right. It's interesting. So how often, and these are live classes that you're running for free on a regular basis? And they just fill up a spot and you do a Zoom class or something like that? And okay,
they reserve their spot. Yeah, I'm always running them. I love it because there's a live chat going on and I'm answering questions. But people love it because they can select a time and a day that works for them. And there's lots of choice. So get lots of people coming in that way. And even if they don't buy the course, they're still in my world now. So that's a good thing too.
In your paid course, what's the framework of that? Is that a multi-course thing or multi-course meal course? Or is it a single class or?
It's 5 modules. Each module has pre-recorded videos, workbooks, quizzes, and we work our way through the major grapes, the major pairings. Again, the food pairings is a big part of it. And I'm always adding new modules like holiday turkey dinner. Okay, let's look at all, not just turkey, but all the ways you can cook turkey. And then all the side dishes, let's pair them all with wines in case, you're really into cranberry sauce. But as I say, there's also a live component that continues for life, like those biweekly tastings. We're always tackling a different topic, either a food and wine pairing topic, or let's just dive down onto New York Riesling or whatever it is, so that the two components work together.
Yeah. Are those 5 modules that are in there, are they all recorded, or is it on demand, or is there an option to do a full on live session with you?
Yeah, both. So all of the
Okay.
modules are pre-recorded on demand. You can download them offline, like if you're traveling and you want to watch them while you're on the plane or by the beach. As I mentioned, I took a course on how to create online courses. So they're all snackable. They're all like 7 to 9 minutes. There's probably 70 videos, 70 or 75. So you can go through them quickly, or you can binge watch Netflix style if you want to get through them all in less than a day. So it depends on what you want to do, but people love being able to start when they want and resume it maybe 6 months, a year later. It's lifetime access. So, and I think that's the way online courses will go because people are busy and they want to have that flexibility. But the biweekly tastings are live and in person with me via Zoom.
Interesting. So what areas of your business are you the most excited about going forward?
The courses, the podcast. I love the people I get to meet, like you. You both are going to come on the podcast in a couple of weeks. We're going to chat. We'll switch the tables here. But I love meeting all sorts of fascinating people. I look for storytellers, someone who can share with my audience not just information, but ways to deepen their pleasure of wine, their understanding of wines, tell some stories. So I'm always excited about the upcoming guests that are coming on the podcast. But also, I'm looking forward to writing my third book. So it'll be more of a memoir than the first 2 books, but still deeply, deeply rooted in the world of wine.
Cool.
So obviously, the last 18 months or so has been a little bit chaotic and different for many of us around the world. I am curious now that as we're starting to come out of the pandemic, what are you most excited about in the world of wine for 2021? What even like that you're just looking forward to seeing emerge or happen or do yourself?
Sure. I'm looking forward to being able to visit wine regions again, even locally. Just we have some fabulous wine regions. None of us have been able to visit them for a long time. I just think it's such a beautiful way to learn about wine. I mean, you in the situation where you're tasting and you're seeing the vineyards and perhaps talking with the winemaker and so on. I'm also excited about going back to restaurants. I always call going back to restaurants my family sport because we're not very sporty, but we love to go to restaurants and that's where we talk and enjoy. And we used to try to go to restaurants and then book a theater. It's like we never want to leave the restaurant table. It's like I remember one night we gave away ballet tickets because we just were having so much fun at the restaurant. So I can't wait. We're just opening up like that now, indoor dining here. So Saturday is our first night going back to indoor dining. Cannot wait. So yeah, and just trying new wines, still meeting more people through the courses, interviewing folks. It's all good.
And just as a quick follow on, in terms of Canadian wine, as there's been everybody I know in Canada keeps telling me how great Canadian wine is. If you wanted to kind of open up someone's eyes to the quality of Canadian wine, of dry wine specifically, which region would you be pointing them at, or which style of wine would you be pointing them at to check out?
I tell them to take a cross-country tour, picking favorite children here, but I'm from Nova Scotia, so I'd say start in the Annapolis Valley with Lac du Blanc and Tidal Bay, Atlantic coast seafood, lobster, melting butter on the beach. Then I'd take you on a trip to Quebec, the Eastern Townships, where I get you to try maybe some ciders, hard ciders, as well as some really bright, crisp white wines, even Chardonnay. Then, of course, we come to Ontario and we take a visit down to Niagara. Prince Edward County is new, but so exciting. And all of these regions have such great restaurants, often attached to the wineries. So it's really worth making the trip. And then, of course, we'd go out to BC, where there are another 3 or so different regions. So I'd invite you to come and visit first, because I think that is the best way. It's also the most selection. But I'd also say, like, look beyond ice wine. Don't forget it, but look beyond. I mean, just recently, a wine from Niagara won the Chardonnay du Monde, best in show, best Chardonnay in the world, not for Canada, but in the world. And whatever you think of different competitions and medals, Canadian wines are really seriously good on the world stage and, really worth trying.
Awesome. Well, Natalie, we appreciate you joining us and spending your morning with us, talking about everything you do in the wine industry. And we've learned a lot. And I think Peter and I might try to steal a few of your ideas for running
Please
courses
do.
or something like that. No, it was great, very informative.
And I invite any of your listeners, if they're interested in any of the things I've mentioned, they can find it all at nataliemclean.com. Take the free class /class, or nataliemclean.com/X for XChateau to get that free wine and food pairing guide.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Robert and Peter. In the show notes at nataliemclean.com/172, you'll find my email contact, a link to the post called Diary of a Book Launch, the full transcript of my conversation with Peter and Robert, links to their website and podcast, how you can join me in a free online wine and food pairing class, and where you can find the live stream video version of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Email me if you have a tip, sip, question, or would like to be a beta reader of my new memoir at natalie@nataliemclean.com. You won't want to miss next week when I chat with Jim Duane, host of the Inside Winemaking podcast. In the meantime, if you missed episode 142, go back and take a listen. In this one, I'm interviewing Robert and Peter about their take on wine marketing and a lot of other really interesting topics. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite. Some of the backlash against influencers, do you think there's misogyny involved?
The traditional wine media and the traditional wine industry doesn't really want to change anything. I don't think they think anything is wrong. Before it was the bloggers, now it's the influencers, and they've always hated something new. Anything that's going to change the establishment. The democratization of these platforms has given people who previously didn't have a voice or couldn't get a voice through the traditional means, have made it easier for them to find their tribe and build up influence and build up credibility. There are people who are just taking a pretty photo with a bottle and that may get a lot of likes and a lot of attention. Or is it really wine content? Who cares if it's helping kind of proliferate wine? And I think, why not try something different? I think that that's where the backlash comes from. I definitely think it is generational as well. There's some age factors in there in terms of a changing of the guard by generations.
If you like this episode, please tell one friend about it this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in the wines and stories we discussed. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.